Morning, everyone, and I would first like to start by also thanking Richard and Pia for organizing this meeting and the entire week, starting with the Young Investigator, Young Emerge meeting that was held. It's just been a fantastic week, and it's been my pleasure to be here with everyone and to be here today. So I'm going to talk to you today about the development of an MECFS research roadmap, and the background for this is that so going back, I first became involved in overseeing research on MECFS around 2015, maybe a little bit before that. And then around 2015, 2016, it was decided that NIH was just not doing enough at that point on MECFS research. And so the actual oversight of research moved from the Office of Research on Women's Health to NINDS, to the institute I'm in. And the director of our institute, Walter Koroshetz, really took charge. And we decided in 2017 to form a working group, our advisory council. So our council is a group of investigators, individuals from the lay community who advise the director of the institute. So we formed a working group to advise the director and our institute, and actually NIH overall, about what was going on in MECFS research and what was needed. So there was a 2019 report to the council that laid out mostly infrastructure issues. So what was needed in terms of developing a biobank, the really significant issue we had around workforce issues, both in research and clinical care, and those kinds of issues. And one of the recommendations in that report was that we begin a process to do a research strategic plan. So almost immediately after that, we began working on putting a plan in place to start that process. And then COVID hit. So we were actually going to launch it around March of 2020 and just could not do that with the clinicians very busy in the hospitals taking care of people with COVID, researchers trying to figure out how to keep their research going when their labs were being closed. So we put a pause on that and then restarted the process in 2022 and actually launched in February of 2023. So the roadmap report was completed and accepted by our advisory council recently in May of 2024. And I'm going to try to give you a high-level overview and hit some of the high points. The report is on the website. It's over 100 pages. But I encourage you to take a look at it because we really, I think, covered the waterfront of research on MECFS. So why is this project important? Well, the goal really was to assess current MECFS research activities and identify opportunities and gaps in the research to identify targets for development of treatments. And that was really the goal, is not to just say, okay, what research needs to be done, but what research needs to be done to drive to treatments for MECFS. But it was also to create an updated summary of the explosion in scientific progress since there was an Institute of Medicine report in 2015 in the United States to focus specifically on MECFS while still recognizing the new knowledge that we might gain from studying long COVID, and to provide a forum to consider the many dimensions of this complex multi-system disease. In other words, to emerge from our silos, but to learn how we can work across all areas of MECFS research and to foster creativity and create collaborations. And so we wanted to immortalize this combined expertise and make it publicly and widely available. And like I said, it is available on the website, and all of the webinars are available, and I'll give you the link to that at the very end. So we started by appointing a working group of council that involved many different individuals across the whole community of individuals impacted by MECFS. The co-chairs were Maureen Hansen from Cornell, who is here at the meeting, and Cindy Bateman from the Bateman Horn Center in Utah. We had leaders of patient advocacy groups who participated, including Richard. We had clinician scientists, research investigators, and our federal partner from the CDC, Beth Unger. And we also appointed individuals with lived experience. So we had a nomination process where people could self-nominate or be nominated to participate in the process, and we had about 100 individuals who were nominated or self-nominated, and we selected these individuals to participate actually on the working group. But then we also identified an additional 21 individuals who participated in the process with us. So these individuals were either people who themselves have ME, or they were caregivers of individuals, either partners or spouses, children of individuals with ME. So the charge to the working group was to develop a research roadmap to provide scientific guidance to the council on how to best advance research on ME/CFS. So consistent with the charge, the group will assess current research activities, opportunities, and gaps to identify the targets for development of treatments. So it was challenging, and I see Maureen here. We've had several conversations as to how to actually organize the process because it's so broad. And it was interesting because in our institute, if you do a strategic plan like this on, say, ALS, you're only thinking about the spinal cord. And so it was kind of challenging to think about initially how to actually organize the process. So we just divided it initially into 7 domains, as you see here, and I'll talk about each one of these. And when we were having the conversations for the physiology webinar and working group, we decided that it was too broad and formed a separate one on less studied pathologies. So each one of these working groups worked to develop a 1-day webinar, invited speakers who presented to us. All of this was also available live via Zoom and recorded. And then following each of those webinars, we had closed session discussions with the speakers to really then digest. What did we just hear? What's really are the critical important points that came from those webinar discussions? So they were held between August of 2023 and January of 2024. And we asked the speakers to address the 3 issues. What do we know and what don't we know? But most importantly, what do we need to know to move toward clinical trials? So the webinar subtopics that were explored in depth really covered, as I said, the waterfront. And we tried to be as comprehensive as possible. It was really, I think, quite a significant effort. And Cindy Bateman actually did these 2 slides because I think what's important is to show what's in red here is what's new since the 2015 report. So if you think about that in the last 9 years, all of these new areas of research in ME have opened up. It's pretty significant. There's been some pretty significant progress made across all of these areas in ME research. So to start by just giving you some of the highlights of the overarching priorities, clearly one of the most important things that came from this was the need for collaboration between researchers, clinicians, people with ME, and advocacy groups which is critical for success going forward. We need multidisciplinary research, cooperation, collaboration, and data sharing. In the United States, we've developed a data sharing portal called MAP MECFS, where investigators can deposit their research and make it available for individuals, other investigators, to come and look at that data, utilize that data for their research or to get research ideas. So the other thing was the need for rigorous research and to really recognize that the heterogeneity of the disease needs to be accounted for and reported in research studies. So this includes the illness triggers and secondary consequences, the stage and duration of illness, the presence, severity, and nature of post-exertional malaise, the comorbid conditions or overlapping conditions, the age of the individual, the sex, environmental factors, genetics, and the specific symptoms being shown by an individual with ME/CFS. If you look back at some of the older papers, it's not even reported whether it's male or female, the age of the individuals, how long they've been ill, their specific symptoms. And so one of the things that came from this is really encouraging and requiring that people really report all of these things in their scientific publications, and most importantly, take that into account in their research. The other thing was the need to expand biobanks, which is essential to facilitate research. In the United States, we have a biobank that's supported by NINDS called BioSend, where we currently have some biospecimens from a study of 200 individuals with ME/CFS and controls. We're just about to add a very large number of biospecimens from a CDC study, and we're encouraging ME/CFS researchers in the United States to add biospecimens to that biobank. And those biospecimens, excuse me, can be identified by investigators by going to a tool called Search ME/CFS. And what was also discussed is that most studies actually have focused on blood derivatives or studies utilizing blood, and that there are some studies on cerebrospinal fluid, some on muscle, but we really need to expand the research beyond just looking at blood and also expand our biobanks to provide those different biospecimens for research. So the other thing that's important is in research in the United States, and I think worldwide, is the importance of involving people with lived experience in the research and engage them at all levels of research. We found during the process of developing the research roadmap that the individuals with lived experience provided invaluable insights and their perspective in all of the different webinars, all of the different discussions. We also recognize how challenging it was for many of them to participate. Many of the webinars were 5, 6, 7 hours, 8 hours if you included the closed discussion. We tried to accommodate that by having multiple breaks to really accommodate the individuals with lived experience. But we also know that it was really challenging for many of them, but we so appreciate the input and their participation in the process. We need to continue to develop partnerships between federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, and people with lived experience to move the research forward together and to make sure that although replication in science is important, we don't need duplication. And so how can we work together moving forward? And also here, the need to partner with pharmaceutical and biotech companies. They're beginning to come out of the woodwork. They're becoming interested. And I think I was talking to some people last night. Long COVID, as devastating as it has been a good thing for ME/CFS. It's really made people aware of chronic post-infectious disorders. And it's made the pharmaceutical and biotech companies wake up and say, oh, this is really important. There's a huge market here. We need to really begin to start looking at what we can do to help individuals who have these ongoing chronic infectious diseases. Overarching priorities for clinical trials. As I said, this was really the main focus of all of the discussions, is to move toward clinical trials, and they must incorporate correctly diagnosed individuals and targeted treatments depending on phenotyping. So what does that mean? It means, first of all, we need to come to a consensus, and this is part of the discussion we had the other evening, a consensus about what case definition are we using across the world to identify individuals with ME. And we need to really understand that we're putting individuals with specific symptoms of ME into the most appropriate clinical trials for them. And so those are some of the things that we're thinking about, talking about. How can we set up clinical trials where we have multiple clinical trials going at the same time that we can slot people into depending on their particular manifestations of the disease. We're looking into utilizing existing clinical trial networks in the United States that we have. We have a nationwide neurological network called NeuroNext. There's a worldwide or countrywide now network for the long COVID clinical trials. So rather than spending the money to set up new infrastructure, how can we utilize what we already have in place? We know there are known drugs that can be repurposed for ME treatment according to our existing knowledge now. And again, this is something that we talked about the other night, and it's an ongoing discussion. We need to utilize information for what works and what doesn't work from reports from individuals with ME, as you'll see in the poster out in the hallway. We need to develop interventions targeted to molecular and immune phenotyping of individuals with ME, design clinical trials to collect and utilize biospecimens. So don't do what we want to also do designing clinical trials is to set it up such that you're collecting biospecimens from the study participants before the study begins and during and after the intervention, so that even if there's groups that respond and individuals that don't respond, what can we learn from that? Why did some of those individuals respond and why didn't others respond? So really learning from our clinical trial efforts. And then standardize and validate tools available to assess outcomes of treatments. So again, this is another conversation that's going to continue with our international collaborators to really understand what are the best measures of functional outcomes and what are more specific measures of fatigue, of sleep, that we will try to come to consensus on to utilize across these clinical trials so that we can compare results from one clinical trial to the next. So to focus on just a couple of the sessions, the webinar working groups and the webinars they had. So one of the sessions was on chronic infection. This was led by Maureen Hansen. So what do we know? We know about 3/4 of the individuals with ME mention onset following a flu-like illness or mononucleosis or SARS-CoV-2. Outbreaks have occurred multiple times in the last 100 years, most recently during the mid-1980s. Evidence for enteroviruses as a pathogen has been shown in some outbreaks. Clear evidence, obviously, of coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 as a pathogen for long COVID. What do we need to know? So if you look at the report, I have, 4 bullets here? I don't remember. There's probably 10 or more for each one of these areas. So I'm just kind of hitting on the highlights. But what do we need to know? We need to know which infections can incite ME/CFS in outbreaks and sporadic cases. Can Epstein-Barr virus incite ME, reactivate and maintain the illness, or is it only a susceptibility factor? Is there reactivation of existing pathogens? So once you are hit with a new pathogen, are you reactivating existing pathogens that you have in your body? Or are inciting pathogens or derivatives of them still present in some cases of ME/CFS? And this is a large area of investigation now in long COVID to see why are individuals with long COVID continuing to be ill? Are they continuing to carry parts of SARS-CoV-2, antibodies against them? What is happening that is inciting these individuals or causing these individuals to continue to be ill? So for the immune system, there's abundant evidence, and I didn't list it all here, of alterations in the immune system, clearly, and a large number of things that we need to know here. And I think that, again, there's very active research ongoing in this area. And I think most importantly to think about, there have been studies on the microbiome, there's studies on the immune system, there's studies on the brain, but what's the interplay between all of these things? So how can we understand that if you develop ME, how is that impacting your microbiome, and how is changes in your microbiome influencing the immune system and the nervous system? We now know they all communicate through the vagus nerve. And so how is all of this continuing to work in a vicious cycle to continue the disease? For the nervous system, really a lot of the discussion focused on unrefreshing sleep, cognitive brain fog, and orthostatic intolerance, because we know that these are critically important symptoms and disabling symptoms in ME/CFS. So there are many things we need to know. We need to improve our tools for assessing cognition. And this is in the United States, we're working very closely with Gudrun Lang, because during the pandemic, all of the cognitive testing moved to online and remote testing, which actually could potentially be very helpful for individuals with ME who cannot leave their homes, but could participate in research by being able to be assessed from their home. So there's, again, lots of other issues here in terms of really understanding the neurological impact of the disease. One of the, I think for me, the most exciting webinars was the one on genomics and genetic susceptibility, because thanks to Ovid Amate, who was at the time the executive director of Solve ME/CFS initiative in the United States, we uncovered many groups doing research and who had data on the genetics of ME that we had no awareness of. And so we brought these people together. The webinar presented a lot of data that we had not seen or heard before. We also know that there is a huge amount of data on self-reported individuals with ME/CFS that is sitting in 23andMe's database. And so we're going to bring together a genetic consortium to try to pool all this data to really understand what information we have. And the interesting thing is many of the individuals who presented are also doing genetics and looking at genetic susceptibility in long COVID. And really what we think we're seeing from the data that was presented is that there's not one gene that causes ME, but many genes that lead to a genetic susceptibility, so a genetic risk that if you're fine, but if you are hit by pathogens, hit by multiple pathogens, then you have a greater risk of developing chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS. So one of the other, and actually the most attended, well-attended webinar was the one on less studied pathologies. So this raised all of these issues regarding connective tissue disorders, spinal and mechanical conditions, mast cell activation, gastrointestinal conditions, neuroendocrine dysfunction, and sex differences and reproductive health conditions. Most of the things that we don't ever do research on, at least not in the United States, or have not been considered. And so what are the causes of the disorders and what's their role in ME/CFS? And how do we diagnose and treat these disorders in individuals with ME/CFS? Do we treat them the same as someone with Ehlers-Danlos, for example, who does not have ME/CFS? And really to begin to understand the role of all of these really significant conditions that we learned from our individuals with the disease really significantly impact their lives. So I'm running out of time, so unfortunately I'm going to skip ahead here. But I'm happy to share these slides, and all of this is in the report. So our next steps is we have an trans NIH working group that is already working together to develop a plan to address the research priorities that we've identified. Together with our federal partners, we hope to work with all of our nonprofit organizations and people with lived experience. And there's a new funding announcement that I'm working on that will come out soon to provide specific funding for research on ME/CFS. We, as I said, are developing an ME/CFS genetics consortium. We have the start of an ME/CFS clinical trial working group that we've already started discussions, had an excellent meeting the other night, and we'll have ongoing discussions and additional plans to be announced going forward. So you can find all of this information at this URL, at this link. That's kind of a long link to write down, but you can simply go to www.nih.gov and search for ME/CFS Research Roadmap Report, and that will take you right to the page that has the roadmap, a link to all the webinars, and to all of the information. And with that, I'll stop and take questions. With the last comment that we did this research roadmap, obviously, as part of our work at the NIH, but we hope that other countries and other investigators and other federal agencies, other nonprofits will adopt and will look at the report and join us in a worldwide effort, really, to try to find new treatments and cures for ME/CFS. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions. Thank you.